Hi, everyone. My name is Mo, and I'm here to start off our second masterclass for the month of March, Black Feminism for Parents. We're also known as the origins of Black feminism, and it's intended for parents. I really enjoyed last February or last month when we had just started to get into the weeds of what Black feminism is, and I'm really excited to go through the content for today. But before I do that, I thought I could start off our session with a little something different. So at the top of last month's class, I kind of mentioned it was Black History Month, and it was a real honor to be able to be starting off and launching the masterclass in February with Black History Month. And so in the same vein, I'm here to help celebrate Melanin March. Happy Melanin March. Don't let anyone tell you that just because Black History Month is over, that there isn't a reason to celebrate the Black community and Blackness in general. And so I am on a commitment to continue that celebration throughout the year. So Black History Month was just the kickoff. And for March, we have Melanin March. So hopefully you can join me in that celebration. So I've been starting off my classes for March a little differently because I want to recognize where the world was like this time last year. And so I wanted to invite you all to join me in a short meditation to kind of reflect on the time that's passed and give ourselves space to feel and to process. And so I just ask that you find somewhere comfortable, kind of minimize distractions, and kind of join me in this short meditation. So first, I ask that you place your feet on the floor, flat on the floor, and just find a comfortable position. You can lower the gaze, or even close your eyes altogether. And we're going to start off just focusing on our breath. Just noticing our breath. And how it feels in our body. Something I like to push my students to do, because oftentimes they're very stressed and they're kind of going from one thing to another, similar to parenting, but probably not on that extreme. I try to encourage them to check in with their body. And so I kind of ask them in this meditation state, if your body could talk, if your body could send you a message, what would your body tell you? And so I encourage you all to just take a moment in a relaxed position and begin to ask yourself that question of, if my body could talk, what would my body be saying? Would your body be thanking you? Would your body be making some demands? Could it be asking you some questions? Why haven't we been moving? Why haven't you fed me regularly? Why aren't you gentle with me? Why don't you have a gentle touch with me? What kind of questions would your body be asking you right now? And I want to ask you to go a step further and just notice how your body is feeling. Just notice if there's any pain, if there's any tension. Just kind of take stock of just how your body is kind of navigating the world. And as you're doing so, whether you have a lowered gaze or closed eyes, I want you to imagine what your happy place is. So just imagine, what is a place that makes you feel good, that makes you feel safe, that makes you feel comfortable. And it's okay if this place doesn't exist in real life, if it's somewhere you imagine, if it's somewhere that you've read about or that you haven't actually been, that's totally fine. But I just want you to think of a place that would make your body really happy. Maybe it's your bed, maybe it's the beach, maybe it's the forest, maybe it's in the arms of a loved one. I want you to imagine you're in that place. What does it smell like? What does it feel like? What does it look like? Is it loud? Is it quiet? Where is that place for you? And so while you're in this place, I want you to imagine that you have your phone in your hand, just like this. And you see that it's ringing. You put it to your ear to see who's calling. And you're waiting to hear someone until you hear a voice, and the voice sounds awfully like your own. And I want you to imagine that somehow you've managed to call your past self from March of 2020. Because I know March was a really strange time. It was really when the pandemic had really become a real reality for people in the US especially. I want you to imagine you're on the phone with this younger self, this former self. I want you just to wonder, how are you doing? You're on the phone call and you just ask, how are you doing? What would your younger self say back to you? Think back to this time last year, a year ago. What would your answer have been to that question? I want you to imagine you're on the phone and you're asking this younger self, what is your life like? What's on your mind? What's on your heart? What are some of those things that were taking up a lot of space mentally and like spiritually in your heart this time last year? You're still on the phone and you ask another question. You say, are you surprised? You ask your younger self, are you surprised by how things turned out a year from that day where you are now? Would you say you're surprised? And before you hang up this phone on this younger self, this younger version of yourself, you say two things. You say, hey, listen, I am so sorry about fill in the blank. What is something that you want to apologize to your younger self for? You say, I am so sorry about. And then before you hang up, you want to make a promise to this past self. So you say, I promise you that What's a promise that you want to make to your younger self as you look to the future in 2021 and beyond? What's something you want to promise your younger self? And with that, you hang up the phone and you take stock of this happy place that you created for yourself. And I want you to decide to choose one thing to bring with you back into this reality of yours. Whether it's the sound of the ocean or the smell of your mom's cooking, wherever that happy place looked like for you, I want you to try to think of one thing you can take away from it and bring into your own reality. How can you begin to take the space that you're in and make it seem more aligned with that happy place that you imagined for yourself? So with that, come on back. I hope that gave you an opportunity to reflect and to even just think about how time has passed and the things that you've done in this past year. I know for my students, they had really positive feedback because otherwise they would have kind of just kept going. And it's really easy to do that, to get kind of sucked into the day-to-day and what's in front of you, and then not really taking a moment to appreciate the change, the progress, the surprises that have happened in the past year, especially given such a tumultuous and kind of like critical year it was in 2020, coming into 2021. But thank you for engaging with that, and I will now go into the content. I want to make sure that I'm creating more space for these meditations and these meditations and contemplative thoughts, just so that just so that we're more aware of ourselves. And that's a big part of Black feminism, is becoming more aware of our bodies, more aware of our intentions, more aware of what our priorities and our reflections are within our identities as Black folks, and especially as Black women. So welcome back to the Origins of Black Feminism, Parenting as a Black Feminist. Today's plan is to start off with a meditation, as you saw. And we'll be tackling two really big questions. Number one is, what is a womanist? And then number two, what is misogynoir? So maybe you've heard of these terms in your own, through media or kind of in passing. And my hope is, after this session, to be able to really be able to define and understand what these words mean in our own lives. Because it's one thing to have these buzzwords be thrown around. You hear it here and there. You kind of have an idea of what it means, but not a deep understanding. And so my hope for our time together is to really begin to tap into that deep understanding of this vocabulary. And then lastly, we'll be going over the 5 stages of racial identity development. So this is a model that was conceptualized by William E. Cross, who was an African-American scholar. And this is I think it's a really nifty tool for appreciating Black feminism. And I also think it's going to be a really helpful reference point as a parent, as you see yourself and your child begin to go through these stages of racial identity development. And we'll dive more into the content there, but I'm really hoping that can become a framework in which you can kind of understand where your child is in terms of their identity development. And also for you as well, understanding, where am I in terms of these stages and where do I want to be? So I'm really excited to go through those 5 stages. But before we get to the new content, I wanted to do a quick recap of all the things that we covered in our last masterclass in February. So I have a quick February recap, just going over kind of these broad themes that we touched on. Firstly, starting off with Black feminism as a movement. So in our first class, we really wanted to deconstruct what Black feminism was. And so we split it to these three categories of a movement, a framework or a way of thinking or thought leadership, into a way of life. And so in terms of the movement and from a historical viewpoint, the Black feminism movement really gained traction in 1970 when the women's suffrage movement was lacking this intersectionality of having women of color and Black women be represented in their constituency. And so the women's suffrage movement was primarily composed of white women fighting for the right to vote and for political and social power. And then what we're also seeing at the same time within the civil rights movement is that a lot of the priorities and kind of the leaders that were leading that movement were Black men. And so therefore, a lot of the priorities in terms of the advocacy and in terms of kind of the rights were also centering Black men. And so in our last class, we really spoke of this idea of the women's movement not being encompassing of Black women, and then the civil rights movement not being led by Black men, but not being encompassing of Black women. And so we really saw the rise of kind of the Black feminist movement. And I always tell my students, we have the formalized kind of structure and institutionalizing it and gathering in 1970, but who's to say that Black feminism didn't exist before 1970? It may have not had that formal label or the formal title or formal political power, but I have a theory, and a really sure one at that the Black feminist movement had been around for many years and had been in the lived experiences of Black women at the time. So this movement had then translated it into a way of thinking or thought leadership, which is a lot of what we cover and will be covering in this masterclass, is how what this movement stood for kind of translates to our day-to-day in the way that we think and the way that we understand and perceive the world. One of the biggest things I want to highlight here is that because of the identities that Black women hold, having being a racial minority and a gender minority, it creates a way of understanding the world and understanding how privilege and power intersect and work together. And so Black feminist thought is a way of thinking in such a way that we are looking to the world in a way that captures the nuances of privilege and the nuances of power. And we're really looking to Black women and Black women's lives to understand that. A really favorite quote of mine from Brittany Cooper, where I have her book right here, Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower. So I'm always recommending books and resources, and Eloquent Rage is a great one. But I love what Brittany Cooper says about the essence of Black feminism, which is just centering the experiences and the lives of Black women and girls, and using that kind of as a testimony and a way of understanding the world. And then lastly, we kind of see it translate from a movement to a way of thinking to lastly, if I can move the clicker, oopsie. So lastly, a lifestyle. And so I have Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement here, her quote. And really what it's meant to encompass is this, stepping out of this academic world, this scholarly world, kind of bringing that Black feminist thought into our day-to-day. And I'm actually thinking, I have Tarana Burke's quote here, but I'm also thinking of Issa Rae when she kind of said those really famous words, "I'm rooting for everyone Black." And that's really, I think that really also captures what Black feminist thought as a lifestyle is trying to get at. It's this idea of I'm rooting for everyone Black, and I value and I work to center the identities of Black women and Black people in my community. So it's not simply just, I know these words, I know the academic, I know this, I read Audre Lorde. It's also about welcoming that into your own life. And And my hope is over the course of these master classes that you can also begin to ask yourself, what does it look like to be a Black feminist in my own day-to-day, especially as a parent? What does it look like to parent as a Black feminist? And that answer will definitely vary across depending on who's answering and the experiences that they hold. So there's no really right answer, but it's something that I encourage you all to keep returning back to is what does it mean to parent as a Black feminist? And here I'll interject a quick disclaimer that you do not need to be Black and you do not need to be a Black woman to be a Black feminist. Being a Black feminist has less to do with your own identity and more to do with your practiced life of empowering and centering Black women and Black people. So I want to kind of give that caveat before we go in. A really great way of understanding Black feminism and the need to center Black girls is looking at disability justice. So I'll read this cartoon and then I'll break it down for you all. So we have this little boy or this person in a wheelchair, and we have these kids who are standing outside, and they're both these groups are trying to go inside for school. And so this boy in the wheelchair says to the janitor, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the janitor says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I'll clear a ramp for you." And the boy in the wheelchair says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." And it says, "Clearing a path for people with special needs clears the path for everyone." So the former terminology of this is called the curbside effect. And it has to do with the curb and the way that when you're driving in the street, if you notice the curb is at a slight incline, and it's meant to accommodate the people in wheelchairs, but it also accommodates people with strollers, people with luggage, older, elderly folks who might have trouble going from a sharp incline to a flat incline. And so the curbside effect really tries to capture the fact that when you accommodate the most kind of the most vulnerable population, you are looking out for everyone. And so I really like looking to disability justice and Black feminism and seeing the intersections, because in a lot of ways I see that mirrored in Black feminism. When we censor the life and the needs of Black women and Black girls, it not only looks out for those specific communities and those specific individuals, it looks out for everyone. Because when we uplift and we center our most vulnerable population, our most marginalized group, it benefits society as a whole. And so I wanted to bring this cartoon in here to really capture the curbside effect and disability justice and how it correlates to Black feminism. All right, that was our recap. I hope that wasn't too exhaustive, but that kind of starts to touch on what the main tenets of what we were talking about in our last class included. All right, so now that we have this class recap, we can begin to dive into these bigger questions of what is womanism, what is misogynoir, and all of these things. The perfect person to start with is Alice Walker. I absolutely love Alice Walker. I attended a webinar by her 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she's just so funny. She is very blunt, and she is very charismatic. In fact, in the interview that I was watching her in, it was over Zoom or over some kind of digital webinar, and she actually received a phone call in the middle of this interview, and she picks it up and she says, "Yeah, I can't talk right now, like I'm in an interview." And then the person on the phone says, "Oh, okay," and like it's on speaker, and it's just very informal for someone who is just like very revered, excuse me. And so Alice Walker, you might know her as the author and poet of The Color Purple. She is most known for her literary work in The Color Purple that was later adapted to a theater performance. She's most known for her work in The Color Purple, but she's also written many other books, including In Search of Our Mother's Garden, which is where she actually coined the term womanism. So hello Alice Walker. Here, let's head over to our next slide. So it was Alice Walker who coined the term womanist, and she did it in her book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And it was kind of this word that she coined herself, and then womanism then became a womanist. And so what is womanism? What is womanist? Womanism really is a term. There, before I jump into that, I will say that people have different interpretations of these words, especially these very big words that are really politically charged. And so I will say my definition of womanism is based on the work of Alice Walker, who was the woman who coined the term. But I'm sure you'll see other people's interpretations of womanism, and people, kind of tweak it to fit whatever identities or agenda that they hold. But my definition is kind of the purest definition according to Alice Walker. And so Alice Walker founded this term womanist to describe a Black feminist or a feminist of color. And it was meant to really begin to unite women of color, and especially Black women, in this feminist movement, especially when, with the women's rights issues was really started with middle class cisgendered white women. And so this was kind of a reclamation of what it means to be a feminist, and really acknowledging those who did not hold those identities of being white and middle class. In other words, it really united women of color within the feminist movement at the intersection of race, class, and gender oppression. Because there was a myriad of ways that the feminist movement fell short, especially in its origins. And one of those really dealt with class. And then, of course, the other was race. And, of course, the other was kind of having these the intersections of such. So not just one or the other of race or class, but being in the position where it is not only your race, maybe coming from a lower income or impoverished background, also being a woman of color or a Black woman. So that was the essence of the adaptation of womanist or womanism. And then Alice Walker went on to kind of quote that womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. So especially in modern day, it's really easy to have these very partisan kind of constructions of language, and womanist is the opposite of feminist, or all of these things. But Alice Walker made it very clear that womanist was not in contradiction of feminist. And so in this quote, she really poses womanist as this umbrella term, or also purple. So it's this umbrella term that feminist then falls under, similar to how purple is like the main color and then lavender is a subset of the color purple. Yeah, and I think there's a larger conversation to be had here about the origins of feminism, what it means to be a feminist. And really what I want to make known is that people have different interpretations, and people have different ways of approaching this language. And especially with feminism, because of its predominantly white and middle class roots and origins, people will always associate feminism and that term as belonging to white women, especially middle class, or not only white women, but also those of higher socioeconomic status. And so there's a conversation to be had of some people would distinguish that as white feminism versus feminism. But Alice Walker kind of really postulated that womanism is a celebration of womanhood that feminism then falls under. And I have this really nifty YouTube video that I thought would be really beneficial to share. So here, I'll play it here.
Are you a feminist or a womanist? A question a lot of Black women will inevitably ask themselves while they're exploring feminism. Is womanism just feminism rebranded, or is there a little bit more to it than that? Well, in this video, I'll be explaining and exploring what is womanism. Womanism is a term coined by Alice Walker, who famously wrote the novel The Color Purple. The term first appeared in her book In Search of Our Mother's Garden, Womanist Prose, published in 1983. She created womanism to center Black women in a feminist movement that largely benefited middle-class white women. While Black women also benefited from the feminist movement, their contributions weren't acknowledged, and thus womanism was created. Because white women are often seen as the standard victims of sexism, feminism tends to be very white and rarely considers how Black women specifically deal with being Black and female. This often means Black women participating in larger feminist movements tend to feel as though they have to choose between fighting against racism or sexism. Often because of the erasure of Black women within the feminist movement, Black women participating in feminism sometimes feel like they have to fight against the racism among feminists who don't see the need to include critiques of white supremacy in their fight against gendered oppression. These feminists are referred to as white feminists, not necessarily because they're white, but because their feminism really only seeks to serve white women, while actively overlooking Black women. And that's been consistent through the history of feminism, where Black women were often asked to stand in the back of the line while white women asked for their rights first, and considered the goals of Black women to be antagonistic to their own. Alice Walker defines a womanist as a Black feminist or feminist of color, a woman who loves other women sexually or non-sexually, and sometimes individual men sexually or non-sexually. She is committed to the survival and wholeness of all people, male and female. She isn't a separatist, except periodically for her own health. She loves music, dance, the moon, the spirit, and loves love and food and roundness. She loves struggle, her people, and most of all, she loves herself. It's important to know that while womanism is about loving and appreciating Black women and critiquing the classist and racist aspects of white feminism, it's also about supporting and empowering Black men, who are often integral parts of a Black woman's life and family. When it comes to differentiating between womanism and feminism, Alice Walker says womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender, meaning that there are only slight differences between being a womanist and being a Black feminist. Womanists largely do support the larger feminist movement and their ultimate goals, but have carved out their own space to specifically center Black women, whereas Black feminists tend to do the same, but seek to work within the existing feminist movement and structure. Well, I hope this video helps you understand a little bit more about womanism. If you'd like to continue to learn, share, and grow, you can keep watching some What Is videos by clicking right over here. And as per usual, don't forget to subscribe for more content.
All right, I hope that was helpful. And I also hope you were able to hear it, but I think Kat did a really excellent job. Let me stop sharing for a moment. Oh, there I am. I think Kat did a really excellent job of really outlining what womanism really comes down to. And then I will continue to make disclaimers, because a huge pet peeve of mine is when nuance isn't recognized and we kind of fall into these very binary ways of thinking, right? And so we all have our own ways to womanism, to feminism, to Black feminism. And what it comes down to is acknowledging that certain movements has history, and that history can continue to characterize that movement, or it could be a means to which a reclamation can happen. And you see that in the second and the third wave feminism. But once we get into, oh, am I a feminist, or am I a feminist? Am I anti-feminist? Am I only a Black feminist? I think that's where it can be a little tricky. And we want to make sure that we're giving ourselves space to grow and to continue learning, and also the grace to understand that these things aren't straightforward, and they can be convoluted at times, they can be complicated, and we should treat them as such rather than working to put them in these very narrow boxes so that we can have this kind of peace of mind. And so, yeah, so that's really what womanism comes down to. In my class, I kind of speak a little on Africana Womanism, which I won't go too much into detail for, but it basically, and I would encourage you all to read and like look into this, research it if it's something that you're interested in learning more about. But really, Africana Womanism is kind of I would say, like the on the spectrum of, it's on the other spectrum of white feminism, and it really, not only where you see womanism and Black feminism being a little more encompassing, Africana womanism is really meant to only capture the experiences and the lives of those of the African diaspora. Excuse me, women of the African diaspora. So it's a little more narrowed in its gaze, and it's not necessarily intended to be then applied to society as a whole. And so that's a small thing I'll add about Africana womanism. Yeah, let me see if there's anything else to add there. Yeah, I'm not sure if you have heard these terms before, if they're nothing new to you, if these are your first time really engaging with this vocabulary. I know for me personally, when I first read about womanism, I felt incredibly seen, because feminists and feminism always felt very white to me in my experience. So I think womanism was a really great entry point to begin to engage with Black feminism and to begin to have language around my own experiences and how they apply to my worldview. So with that, we can kind of transition back into my presentation, and we were going to touch upon misogynoir, which is a great, on the topic of womanism, misogynoir is pretty self-explanatory. Misogynoir really refers to the discrimination and the prejudice that Black women specifically face. And so this is the more specific version of misogyny. So we kind of see this where Black feminist or womanist is the more specific form of feminism, and then misogynoir is the more specific form of misogyny. And so misogynoir really intends to capture the ways that oppression and discrimination and harm falls upon Black women based on their lives as Black women. And so we've already spoken at great length last class about why it is that Black women live such distinct lives. So misogynoir is just a really helpful tool in being able to capture the consequential abuse that comes from having these specific and distinct lived experiences as Black women and Black femmes. So with that, those are really the two big questions for today, misogynoir and womanism. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we want to add before we transition to our last topic. I chose not to cover texturism and colorism in today's presentation just because I want to be mindful of the amount of information we're kind of sharing and digesting. But when it comes to misogynoir, we really see that come to head with things like texturism and colorism. And so I'll stop sharing really quickly. There. I'm not sure if you've heard of colorism or texturism, but colorism refers to the discrimination and prejudice that's received on the color of your skin, especially in terms of how dark your skin is. So the privilege and the power that comes with that may be looking at someone who's a lighter skinned Black woman to a darker skinned Black woman. And it's not tied to just the Black community. It can be colorism happens in all communities, and it really comes to anti-Blackness, which is why it's a really big topic to kind of get to dive into. And so I'll only briefly describe it, and in our following classes, I hope to go into more detail around colorism and texturism. But colorism refers to skin, and then texturism refers to hair type. And so when we look at different curl patterns and how coarse and how the pattern of hair, and this is also can be applied to different communities and different cultures, but specifically in the Black community, we're looking at hair types like 4C, 4B, 4A hair, and the perception that comes with having that type of hair. And so there's also a whole bout to be had about privilege and power when it comes to Black women and Black women's lives, but also taking it a step further and looking into things like hair type, skin color, and then featureism, which refers to kind of how Aryan your features are, like how wide your nose might be, how big your lips or how full your lips are, your cheekbone structure, things. And featureism is really about getting as the standard or the proximity is to European features. And so so really just to begin to speak and acknowledge and capture the myriad of ways that these oppression can manifest in misogynoir, it's really boundless, right? Because we're seeing it can be your skin color, it can be your hair texture, it can be your facial features, and these are all things that white women do not or experience to a very small degree. And so that is why misogyny doesn't really fully capture the experience of Black women, and doesn't really capture the nuances of how sexism manifests, especially with white women being the gatekeepers of femininity and kind of using their femininity as a weapon, weaponizing their femininity and their access to what is considered womanhood or feminine. We see a huge counter and distinction between the sexism that women of color and Black women face compared to the sexism that white women face because of the power and the privilege that they hold as white women, specific to their racial identity. And so I also remember seeing misogynoir for the first time. It's a relatively new term. I think it was founded in 2010, I believe. And the name of the founder is escaping me, but it was a Black woman who founded it pretty recently. And is also meant to, once again, make that distinction that we see time and time again, whether it's Black feminism, womanist, or in this case, misogyny versus misogynoir. All right, so with that, we'll transition into the final part of the presentation, which deals with the stages of racial identity development. And so I wanted to include this because I think it's helpful to begin to quantify and begin to have the language to understand where you might be in terms of your racial identity development, and also be able to take it and apply it to the children in your life, whether it's your own kids or youth in your area or in your community, kind of being able to see and understand where they are in terms of their racial identity and being able to give them the resources and tools that align with that. So I'll share my screen one last time to begin to jump into these 5 stages of racial identity. And I'll try to go pretty slow here to make sure that nothing is really lost. Okay, so as I mentioned, the 5 stages of racial identity development was founded by William E. Cross, he's a Black man and a Black scholar. And so he breaks down these stages into 5. His model breaks down the stages into 5 distinct categories. And something I tell my students here is that it is not linear, though the way that he prefaces the model appears very linear. It doesn't necessarily have to kind of follow this very rigid timeline. And it also doesn't correlate to specific times in your life. You might see patterns and trends where one stage occurs at a certain part of your life, but William E. Cross makes it a point to not include kind of, this happens in your developmental years, this happens in your adolescence, this happens in the young adulthood. He does include that, and I think for good reason, so that it's not confused that adults can't be going through the first stages of racial identity, or that young people can't have access to these latter stages of racial identity development. Starting off, we have the pre-encounter. So this is when the dominant culture surrounds the child and he/she or they can begin to absorb messages about the minority group. So pre-encounter, I almost describe it as when you're young and you haven't really understood or been exposed to the world outside of your immediate household. And so for me, I'm thinking of when I grew up. I grew up in a predominantly in a Nigerian American household, and there was a great deal of time where I wasn't in public school, I wasn't in private schools. I was spending most of my time with my family, and so as a child, you begin to understand culture and identity in a very specific way, and to the point that you almost generalize it. You think everyone has this experience. You think everyone kind of speaks this language at home, or that everyone eats like this. And you're not really exposed to something that tells you otherwise. Oops. And then we have the encounter. So as you can understand, the encounter is that first experience or group of experiences that cause a child to become aware of the impact of racism in his/her, they, or their life. And so the encounter, typically, it can span many years. And for some, there might be like that one moment that they can recall when they were younger and someone had said something to them, or they had read something in the paper, or their parents told them something. And it's really this light bulb memory of becoming acutely aware of their racial identity. Or even if it wasn't necessarily like racial identity, it was the ways in which they were perceived as different or understood themselves as different. And so encounter, in my experience, has typically happened in school settings, community settings, even with family settings where the child or the person is not necessarily responsible for that encounter, but they have been exposed to it either directly or indirectly. And once again, this might happen for the first time in childhood, but it can span years, right? And so an encounter could even be later on in life, in high school or in college, when something very significant happens that kind of brings a certain awareness of the impact that racism has played in your life. Thirdly, we have immersion/immersion. So the adolescent tries to surround himself/herself or their self with people and experiences related to the racial identity that has been brought to the surface. Some are misled by the cultural stereotypes prevalent in the media. So immersion, the word is right there. You're trying to immerse yourself in this understanding of this racial identity that you have become aware of. So you're reading papers, you're Googling Black girl. If I say that in my own experience, just as a young person, Googling Black girl and just seeing what comes up. But you're beginning to seek out information about this racial identity that you have become aware of. And so obviously, this can also span many years and also span a great deal of kind of like resources, right? This could mean picking up the book and reading Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper. Or this could mean, having a conversation with some young friends about the Black community. And so this is a really susceptible time because many adolescents, in this case adolescents, are open to being misled by cultural stereotypes. So just because they're looking at these media and these resources doesn't mean that they're the most accurate or the most pro-social. And so this is a moment in many adolescent lives where they are very vulnerable to these messaging. Fourthly, we have the internalization. So the individual begins to incorporate a more fully developed understanding of the minority group into his/her/their identity. So I think a lot of people begin to have this experience in college, or just post high school, maybe later on in high school, maybe as they kind of go into the workforce, that you're beginning to intentionally internalize this identity of this minority identity. So I joke with my students that this is like the kente cloth phase, which I mean as kind of as a joke, but say just that same idea of really wanting to immerse yourself in your identity and in this, in understanding who you are in relation to your race. So obviously William E. Cross is a Black man, but I don't think he intended the model to be only for the Black community. So I think it can, so I say this in the context of Blackness, but it could be understood and applied outside of that. Finally, internalization/commitment. The individual has become fully integrated into their heritage, into a single identity, and they're able to respectfully share the uniqueness without crushing the uniqueness of another. I think the really distinction here between 4 and 5 is internalization is you're still sensing this lack that you want to be filled. There's this sense that of wanting to be proactive and wanting to be an active participant and beginning to build this identity and affirm this identity, which is like crucial, right? Or at least has been in my experience. But when we step into the stage 5 of internalization/commitment, there's a sense of contentment almost into this identity that there's not necessarily that drive to have to this drive to continue to seek out opportunities, seek out community that affirm this identity. So that's why this first sentence is really like the individual has fully integrated their heritage into a single identity. And so here I wanted to bring up some quotes, which I thought was very funny, but these quotes that kind of correspond with some of these stages of racial identity development. So here we have the pre-encounter is, I think of myself as American and still them as a member of a racial group. So this is pretty advanced. This is pretty mature, like sophisticated language, but this could also mean like, oh, I'm not Black, like I'm just, I'm a tennis player, or I'm not, the most prominent part of my identity isn't my racial identity. It's something that maybe exists in a group or is pertinent to your age group or your immediate surroundings. It's not necessarily your racial identity that is most prominent. And so here, still during the pre-encounter, this is the pre-encounter PM and PSH, which is all happening in the pre-encounter, is like when you're beginning to hear these messages that are a result of stereotype threat or are a result of miseducation and ignorance. And so you haven't necessarily developed the identity in which you're able to contradict these things, or you're able to kind of understand the problematic nature of them, because you're this young person, you're typically a child at this age, and you're still kind of susceptible and vulnerable to this information. Here with IEAW, which stands for Immersion, is an example. It says, I hate white people. And so this is, I think this is funny because it kind of captures this idea of needing to seek out information that's tied to your identity, and by doing that, needing to be exclusionary. So in beginning to celebrate and claim my Blackness, I, by virtue of that, have to begin to deny whiteness and hate white people as a result. IBN refers to internalization Black nationalist, which is an example of what an internalization could look like as a Black naturalist. And it says, as Black naturalists, we must work on empowering ourselves and not on hating others. So this is why I referred to jokingly as the Kente cloth stage, which is really fully immersing and beginning to internalize this Black identity, and having that be translated in the work that you do, in the relationships that you have with the communities that you build, or what have you. And in this case, it's more of a socio-political standpoint of being a Black nationalist. And then lastly, the IMCI refers to internalization, multicultural, inclusive. And so this is really that kind of, I use the word transcendence lightly, but in a way you understand what it means to be a Black person, or what have you identity, to the point that you don't necessarily have to prove it to anyone, or prove it to yourself, more importantly. You've been able to integrate that identity into your sense of being and your sense of knowing, to the point that you can engage with other cultures in a way that doesn't feel, that doesn't necessarily take away from your own identity, if that makes sense. Phew. So that's a lot to process. And here, and we'll do a recap at the top of our next masterclass. But here, I just want to remind everyone that is not linear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even though it is kind of delineated that way. Some people can spend their whole lives in the pre-encounter and then enter the encounter in later in their life, when they become aware of the identity that they had, or they move to a location or a place in which that identity that they had is now amplified or becomes more prominent. Some people could go from pre-encounter to encounter to immersion to back to encounter to immersion again to back to encounter to immersion again, and so on, right? So I really want to challenge this idea of linearity in this model, and really recognize like life is very fluid. Some people never make it to this internalization / commitment phase. And some people, like, they kind of alternate between these phases. They go in and out. So it's not necessarily like this binary, this kind of binary experience, or like linear experience is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my PowerPoint. So I'll stop sharing. Oh, there you are. Every time I say there you are, it's because I'm locating to the tab in which I'm recording. But yeah, we kind of tackled a lot of things today. We started off with our meditation and being in touch with our bodies, kind of as a resistant, as an act of resistance. And then we did a quick recap, and we went into, what is womanism and what is misogynoir, and then ending with, as you saw, the 5 stages of racial identity development. And so I was really excited to share that with my past classes, and it really had a lot of traction, because a lot of people could resonate with these different stages of identity development and seeing themselves in it, and beginning to understand and have language around the experiences that they've had, or the experiences of those in their life. And so I wanted to end our Melanin March. Don't forget, I wanted to end our Melanin March with a book recommendation. I have so many books, as you saw in our first class. But for today, I wanted to recommend this book called The Body Is Not an Apology. And this is by Sonia Renee Taylor. And this is really, you can see all my notes on the end here. This is really just a deep dive into what it means to live within our bodies, especially as bodies that are policed, that are regulated, that are political bodies, just by virtue of being Black. And then Sonia Renee Taylor talks about the intersections of Blackness, of womanhood, and of being a fat Black woman. And so she kind of offers up her own experiences to begin to deconstruct the shame that white supremacy has conditioned us to feel about our bodies, especially in the Black community, especially as Black people and Black bodies. So with that, I'll go ahead and close out the session. Thank you so much for spending this past hour with me, and for attending the masterclass for Black feminism and the origins of it. And I can't wait, and I'm excited to continue this conversation next month. So thank you again, and happy Melanin March. Bye.